Tilea's Troubles, Part 29. The Battle of the Princes. The very western spur of the Trantine Hills. Winter 2401 to 2402. For most seasons, the bridge over the Little Carena was only used by wagons and coaches. Those on foot or horseback found it just as easy to cross the almost dry, stony riverbed. During the months of late autumn and winter, however, it ran somewhat deeper, occasionally requiring a traveller to wade waist deep to cross it. So it was that most of those in the fleeing remnant of the Compagnia del Sole had been forced to cross the bridge, an action which slowed their progress and made many among them fearful of being overtaken by their pursuer, Duke Guidobaldo. Their fear, however, proved unfounded, for not only did they cross in safety, but they then met with Prince Girenzo of Trantio and his relief force. After a brief consultation, it was decided to array as one army upon the northern side of the river, there to make a stand against the foe. The prince did not want the Pavonans to approach any closer to his precious Trantio, and the mercenaries were tired of running and lugging their loot. Besides, as Prince Girenzo and General Fortebraccio agreed, the decision was tactically sound. They both knew that attempting a retreat, while an enemy was close, gave one's own men the distinct impression that they were fleeing. Once soldiers got such a notion into their heads, then all order and cohesion could be quickly and easily lost, so that what they believed would indeed become the case. General Fortebraccio still had some tricks up his sleeve, and by clever use of concealment, some old planks, an unimportant cart or two, and a few broken and useless horses, he successfully misdirected the Pavonans into believing his Compagnia del Sole had deployed with its precious baggage strung out on the far left of the line, and that his heavy horse was clustered in the centre by Prince Girenzo's gentlemen. The trick worked, for this was exactly how the deployment was reported to Duke Guidobaldo, and so he arrayed his own army accordingly. In truth, however, the Compagnia's horse were out on the far right flank, and the baggage train, of course, was tucked safely behind the centre of the Trantian army's line. Duke Guidobaldo had not tarried at Astiano. Once the enemy was broken and fled from the field, he halted only long enough to reform his fighting companies, allow his lightly wounded soldiers to recover sufficiently for the march, and to ensure that the more seriously injured would be tended to when left behind. He knew that if he had been willing to wait just a few days longer, he would receive reinforcements from both Astiano and Pavona, but he was keen to catch the remnant of the Compagnia del Sole before they escaped his clutches, and so retrieve the plunder looted from his newly built settlement upon the Via Aurelia at Casoli. Many amongst his soldiers reckoned he also wanted the world to know that he was not afraid to fight, nor the sort of man to allow hesitation to rule his actions. Upon drawing within sight of the foe, the Duke ordered his army to array itself among the loops of the stream, as if they cared not a jot about slippery rocks, nor being soaked by cold winter waters. His pistoliers had acted as outriders guarding the right flank, until eventually drawing close to the little bridge, just as the army completed manoeuvring into line of battle. The Duke and his son rode with their last few knights, carefully crossing the stream behind the artillery, so that the Duke could see for himself that his precious pieces were well placed. He wanted them to do well, for if they proved worthless, it would make his choice to allow them to slow the whole army down during the pursuit look foolish. The regiment of swordsmen was next in line, flanked by a company of handgunners. Two bodies of halberdiers, separated by a tiny group of archers, came next, while a large regiment of handgunners occupied the far left. His own baggage was safely tucked behind the hill upon which his largest regiment of halberdiers was standing. The pistoliers wasted no time crossing the bridge, and came wheeling boldly from its northern end to ride at a pace. Most sported blue and white cloaks or feathers, so that none could mistake them for anything other than Pavonans. At least on this field of battle, the soldiers of the coastal city of Campagrotta also happened to be clad traditionally in blue and white. They galloped directly towards the petty, forlorn hope of mercenary crossbowmen, isolated upon the hill on the far left of the Trantian line. This bold move, however, was not matched by the rest of the Pavonan army, as nearly every other unit simply stood, waiting. Only the small detachment of archers crept up behind the central hill, while the company of handgunners on the far left found a way to be even more cautious, by falling back a few yards. The Pavonan wizard's magical conjurings harmed no one, merely forcing Lucino Ginecci, the Compagnia del Sole's battle wizard, to read his dispel scroll. At this range not much could be done with the artillery, big or small, and apart from the 3 crossbowmen who fell to the pistolier's close-range volley, only 2 pikemen and 1 of Prince Girenzo's knights were killed by a cannonball. The Trantine army responded somewhat more aggressively, advancing their 4 main fighting bodies without delay. Yet they too displayed elements of caution, due mainly to 2 reasons. None were keen to allow the enemy to bring its full firepower to bear, especially the vicious-looking volley gun. And more importantly, the Pavonans were arrayed in such a way that a considerable portion of their fighting strength might close upon the rather exposed left flank of the Trantian line, most likely supported by their pistoliers. Consequently, while the rightmost regiment of horse, Captain Scarpa's mercenary men-at-arms, moved as fast as possible to close the gap between themselves and the hesitant regiment of handgunners, the Prince's own body of gentlemen moved in such a way as to be concealed by the central hill, and the halberdiers on the left, led personally by the condottieri General Fortebraccio, slowed and wheeled away from the line to angle themselves more towards the enemy threatening from the left. Wizardry and shooting brought about nothing of any real consequence, something Prince Girenzo had thought might well prove to be the case. As he rode on the left in the front rank of his gentlemen-at-arms, he now understood that to defeat this foe he would have to close with them and fight hand to hand. Glancing to his left, he wondered if his well-drilled but inexperienced militia pikemen would prove capable of such a task. He already had his doubts about the Compagnia del Sole. After all, he was only here because they had earlier chosen to flee instead of fight a full battle. Yet he needed the mercenaries. His own meagre force could not fight this battle alone. In light of this, the halberdier's movement away from his otherwise fairly neat line of battle was worrying. He would have to lead by example, and hope that the mercenaries were suitably reassured. If not that, then perhaps they would fight, if only to ensure their employer remained alive, and so able to pay them what they were owed. Some way behind him, the crew of his galloper gun were attempting to line up their piece's muzzle on the pistoliers, knowing a lucky shot now could prove crucial to the safety of the army's left flank. Their shot, however, fell short. The pistoliers took the cannon's failure as a sign to do something immediately or suffer the consequences of a better placed second shot. So, while the crew of the cannon hurriedly reloaded, they ignored the 3 surviving crossbowmen on the hill and hurtled directly towards the gun, headlong to their potential ruin. Duke Guidobaldo and his eldest son, Lord Polcario, had got themselves and their few remaining knights stuck behind the army's artillery pieces. Considering this, and that there was no immediate target for the volley gun, the multi-barrelled gun's crew were ordered to drag it out of the way. As soon as there was space enough, the heavily armoured nobility thundered forwards to the rear of the handgunner detachment. The rest of the foot began an advance, with the 3 main regiments moving obliquely. As they did so, and even though the winds of magic were currently weak, one of the Pavonan battle wizards summoned a flame storm to pour death upon the Trantian pikemen, killing a dozen and leaving the rest reeling, sickened by the foul stench of burnt flesh arising from the charred corpses. With their prince so close, however, the survivors somehow found the courage to march on, despite their horrible loss. The Pavonan wizard was exultant, but his expression of joy was misjudged, as some uncontrolled wisps of magical energy had remained coiled around him. These now burst to send a ripple of destruction through the swordsmen he was marching with, causing no less than 8 Pavonans to fall dead. The wizard did not let it show, and was secretly thankful that the soldiers seemed to believe that the harm was some curse conjured by the foe, not realising it was entirely his own doing. The Pavonan cannon sent a ball directly at Girenzo, who very fortuitously moved out of its path in the last moment. The ball killed the man next to him, spattering blood and splinters of bone on the prince's bright armour. His face blanched, although none saw it as it was hidden behind his visor. The handgunners, threatened by the Compagnia del Sole's heavily armoured horsemen, brought down 2 with a volley, then reloaded sufficiently rapidly to fire another volley as they were charged. Agitated and rushed as they were, this second volley was launched a little too high, and the Compagnia's yellow and white striped lancers hit them hard. A large company of mercenary crossbowmen upon the hill to the right of their baggage now turned to face the Pistoliers, as did General Fortebraccio's halberdiers. Prince Girenzo narrowed his eyes as he watched the latter move further away from him. Trust them to think only of protecting the loot in the baggage. He had intended to hit the foe as one line, the halberdiers on his immediate flank and the crossbowmen supporting the attack. He cared not a jot if the enemy played a while with the baggage, as long as victory was his in the end. This decision by the halberdiers, prompted by the approach of a single enemy company, had effectively broken his little army into 2. The Compagnia del Sole's heavy horsemen smashed through the handgunners, running down all those who fled. What they did not know was that the enemy's cannon crew had spotted them, and were already lugging their piece around to aim it. Had they known, they might have foregone the satisfaction of hacking down an already broken foe, and instead reformed in such a way as to minimise the harm the cannon could do to them. Prince Girenzo led his gentlemen forwards, while the men of the shattered pike regiment, matching his move, were glad of the concealment the hill in front of them provided. Both flew his brightly hued personal banner, and both were garbed brightly. One might think, by their appearance, that they were the sort of warriors unconcerned about being spotted by the enemy's guns, but one would be wrong to do so, for both had spotted the serried muzzles of the organ gun earlier, and heard the blast of the enemy's other artillery piece twice already. They were only too aware of what might await them when they ascended the hill betwixt them and the foe. The mercenary wizard Lucino unleashed a magical blast of chain lightning on the Pistoliers, killing 4. As they turned and fled, the cannon killed another, and cheers went up from the crossbowmen and halberdiers watching. General Fortebraccio allowed himself to smile, but then suddenly wondered whether his order to turn his men to face the now beaten foe was an overreaction. He stepped from the ranks to look towards his employer, the prince, and was forced to accept that he had indeed broken what had been a fairly solid line. Still, he thought, the Pavonans were not exactly rushing towards them. Surely there was yet time enough to restore a fighting formation. Behind the general, Lucino the wizard looked not at the lines, but at him, considering a rather different assessment. The Trantian mercenary crossbowmen and halberdiers watched as the few surviving Pavonan Pistoliers found the courage to rally. At that moment, Duke Guidobaldo at last gave the signal for his army to advance at the double to attack the foe in bloody combat. Swordsmen, knights and halberdiers now all came on, glad to see the enemy had divided itself in 2. The Pavonan gunners on the hill could not believe their luck as they aligned the barrel of their piece to aim down a line of the Compagnia del Sole's mounted men-at-arms. Lowering the linstock to touch its burning matchcord to the trail of bruised powder dribbled behind the touch-hole, they sent a round shot through no less than 5 of the armoured riders. The survivors were stunned, their shock quickly turning into anger at their own stupidity as well as at the foe. Unwilling to allow the Pavonans to gain all the initiative, and hoping somehow to buy time for the prince's knights and the mercenary halberdiers to get themselves into the fight, the Trantian militia pikemen now charged the blue and white swordsmen before them. As the 2 regiments clashed, their banners flew thick above them, for each side carried both their own regimental and their army's banners. The fight became instantly a bloody, furious melee, in which 7 swordsmen and 6 pikemen died, while the commanders fought frantically in their midst. General Fortebraccio, commander of the Compagnia del Sole, knew full well what was required of him, and gave the command for his regiment to reform as swiftly as possible so that he could march them up rapidly in support. His men, however, proved distracted, and it was all he could do to get them to face towards the massed foe instead of the Pistoliers. He knew he would be hard pushed now, to get into the fight quickly enough to swing the balance. The wizard Lucino conjured a harmonic convergence to bless the pikemen and the crossbowmen. Then, deftly directing the winds of magic swirling around him, he sent flashes of chain lightning tearing into the 2nd Regiment of Pavonan halberdiers, killing 6, then lured it onwards to strike at the Duke's own knights, killing 2 of them also. The last few searing bolts strayed towards the handgunner detachment to kill another 2 men. The sound of thunder followed, as is normally the case with mundane lightning, but it was actually the Trantian artillery piece spitting a hail of grape-shot into the pistoliers. 2 more died. The surviving pair, apparently too exhausted, battered and bruised to comprehend fully the awful damage done to them, simply spurred their horses away from the smoke that wreathed them and galloped back towards the centre of the field. Prince Girenzo, leading his gentlemen-at-arms, began now to swing around towards the enemy flank. As he himself rounded the hill, he could see that his militia pike were much reduced in strength, and that not only were the enemy's own heavy horsemen launching into a charge into the isolated pikeman's flank, but a regiment of halberdiers were about to hit the other flank. As the chargers went smashing in, the prince signalled his men to follow him. If the pike could hold just a little longer against the foe, even though outnumbered and surrounded on 3 sides, then he would be leading his knights into the enemy's rear and would surely do great harm to them. There was another small regiment of enemy halberdiers unengaged behind the melee. Prince Girenzo reckoned that he and his knights could still prevail. All hinged upon whether his militia stood their ground, despite overwhelming opposition, including the enemy's general and his valiant son. Far to the rear, the last surviving Compagnia del Sole mounted man-at-arms accompanied Captain Scarpa as he splashed over the little carena towards the Pavonan baggage. The 2 of them intended to kill the peasants tending the horses and mules, then gallop up the slope beyond to the cannon, there to avenge the brutal slaying of their comrades. The Pavonans' attempts at conjuring magical harm proved weak, while their cannon shot at Prince Girenzo's knights simply buried itself into the earth. The last 2 blood-spattered Pavonan pistoliers brought down 2 of the Compagnia del Sole's baggage guard with their shots, and a volley from the handgunners maimed one of the prince's horse artillery crewmen. The melee in the centre of the field proved to be costly, with more than 6 men killed on each side, while Lord Polcario struggled to get to grips with a surprisingly nimble-footed champion. The Trantine battle standard-bearer, made more deadly by the magical harmonic convergence that was still blessing him and the regiment, slew the cowering Pavonan wizard and wounded their own battle standard-bearer. Just like his son, Duke Guidobaldo could not find purchase for his blade. Perhaps the brightly coloured enemy standard fluttering in his face, 6 foot by 6 foot, distracted him. Within moments, before most of the men fighting had taken more than 2 or 3 strained breaths, the ground was strewn with the dead and dying. A little way behind, the mercenary general Micheletto Fortebraccio watched. For a brief moment, he too wondered if the pikemen might hold. If so, then he could lead his veteran halberdiers into the enemy knight's flank. Such an action would win them the battle, for if Prince Girenzo cut into the foe from the other flank, then both Pavonan lords, the Duke and his son, would surely be utterly overwhelmed and perish in the ensuing melee. In this moment, the fate of the whole of central Tilea hung in the balance. If the Lord of Pavona and his heir died here, then Trantio would become the major power. If the Trantians failed, Pavona was very likely to swallow yet another state into its growing empire. Yet, despite the heroic actions of their commanders and the close proximity of their prince and general, it was at that moment that the last of the Trantian pikemen broke and fled, to be hacked down by the pursuing Pavonan nobility. Now, General Fortebraccio had time enough merely to shout the command to brace before the Pavonan knights hit him and his halberdiers at full gallop. Despite this turn of events, Prince Girenzo saw that the battle was still not lost for certain. While the Compagnia del Sole's halberdiers held the Pavonan knights, he and his gentlemen could conceivably cut a swathe through the foe, so that he himself could fight Duke Guidobaldo. And as he thought this, he realised it was what he had wanted all along, to face his enemy in personal combat and cut him down with his own sword. It was time to order the charge. If he was to reach the Duke, however, the Prince would have to plough his way through several intervening units. This he was entirely happy to do, itching to begin the horrible excitement of swordplay in a life-and-death melee. The first body in his way was a company of swordsmen, so with a thunder of hoofs he and his men set off. The swordsmen had seen the Prince's approach, however, and promptly fled away long before he could reach them. This left the Prince and his gentlemen staring at both the wide muzzle of the cannon and the multiple mouths of the hell-blaster volley gun. In that moment, the Prince's previous excitement was entirely and instantly snuffed out. The Duke and his son hit the Campagna's halberdiers hard, slaying 8 of them, including the wizard Lucino, while Lord Polcario bloodied the General Fortebraccio in a personal combat. The men of the Campagna seemed to understand that their reputation and any chance of future success lay upon this combat, and stood their ground defiantly. Once again, however, the Pavonans were readying themselves to charge against a Trantian regiment's flank, and the orders were already being shouted to the battered but intact body of halberdiers close by, and so they charged, led bravely by their stout champion, wielding a bright steel, flamberge-bladed bastard sword. The last surviving pair of pistoliers now hurtled headlong into the left flank of the large body of Compagnia del Cielo crossbowmen on the hill, who had only recently reformed away from the pistoliers in the assumption that they no longer presented a threat. The men guarding the baggage were glad not to be receiving pistol shots, but unnerved by the fact that the enemy was riding so freely close by. Witnessing the blue and white halberdiers crashing into the flank of General Fortebraccio's guard hardly reassured them either. The last surviving Pavonan wizard, having spotted the Prince and his knights, now wove a powerful spell indeed out of the winds of magic gushing about him. Once satisfied that he had bound as much power as possible, he dispatched a magical blast of searing heat at the heavily armoured band, the sort of assault that their layers of steel not only failed to provide protection against, but actually made things worse. 3 of the Prince's 6 companions fell screaming from their saddles as their mounts bucked, reared and squealed horribly, their hide burned by the now superheated metal enclosing their upper bodies. His flesh singed sorely, the Prince tore his helm from his head and gave vent to a loud curse, something which was for him so unusual that 2 of his surviving gentlemen-at-arms turned to look at him rather than at their badly suffering comrades. They even failed to notice, as the cannon on the low hill sent an iron round shot, which flew just above their plumed helmets, but then were cruelly snapped out of their stupor as the hell-blaster sent a very loudly clattering hail of leaden balls into them, one of which went through the slit of a visor to shatter the head inside. Prince Girenzo, blood pouring from his ear, which had been grazed by lead shot, his sword hanging limp from a leather strap tied to his wrist, his own personal standard flying ragged above his head, and his body blistered in a dozen places from the magical heat that had cooked his armour, found his voice had abandoned him. So, silently but with great haste, with wisps of smoke trailing behind them, he and his last few companions yanked their reins, turned their horses about, and fled from the field in the direction of Trantio city. For him at least, the battle was over. His army was destroyed, and his mercenaries were surely in the process of being so. His city, however, still survived. There he had a garrison force, even some artillery pieces too heavy to be brought to this battle. He did not intend also to lose his home to the Duke of Pavona, and it was with this stubborn aim in mind, rather than anguish or fear, despite the pains racking him, that he rode hard and fast away from the battlefield. He had work to do. The 2 pistoliers managed to shoot one of the crossbowmen, but the foe lost no time reforming to face them and bringing their strength to bear. At the rear of the field, entirely unaware of how ill the battle fared for the Campagna elsewhere, and having slaughtered all those accompanying the Pavonan baggage train, Captain Scarpa's angry rage failed to dissipate, and he rode on to attack the crew of the cannon that had felled so many of his men. In the midst of the field, surrounded by scattered corpses and wounded men writhing in agony, the combat continued. General Fortebraccio rained blows upon Lord Polcario, yet was unable to harm him. The Compagno del Sole's halberdiers fought bravely and skilfully, killing another knight in the Duke's retinue, so that only one now remained with the Duke and his son, as well as an enemy halberdier. At another time, with more enemies threatened, this might have broken the Pavonans. But even as they were blooded and pushed back, they could sense the enemy's desperation. And besides, they knew full well that the battle was nearly won. They were not going to run now. The Trantians' light artillery piece's barrel now shivered, maiming both men still crewing it, while near the Compagno's baggage the pistoliers broke and fled away from the crossbowmen. In the middle of the field, Lord Polcario and General Fortebraccio could still do each other no harm, but the halberdiers brought down the last Pavonan knight. The Duke now redoubled his efforts, which had been mighty before, and cut down 2 of the foe, just as 2 more fell to his own halberdiers fighting on the flank. This was the end for the mercenaries, who now, finally, turned to flee, only for each and every one of them to be trampled or hacked down as they did so. General Fortebraccio lay dying amongst them, so battered and bloody that he was barely recognisable, to become just another broken corpse in the pile. As the Duke and Lord Polcario, accompanied now by the last few survivors of the halberdiers, came galloping and running past them, the pistoliers rallied again. They halted momentarily to see that the crossbowmen who had just sent them running were now marching away from the hill and the battlefield, then realised that the 2 noblemen and the soldiers they had just encountered were cheering as they closed upon the baggage train, killing all those who cowered there. With the merest of glances at each other, as if to ask, "Have you anything left?" they spurred their mounts and rushed on to join the looting. The Battle of the Princes was over. Another victory for Duke Guidobaldo of Pavona. Despite how close the struggle had been, he was certain it was another sign that his war was just, despite what the Riemann priests were saying. His army had frightened Prince Girenzo off the field, almost wholly destroyed the Compagno del Sole, and recaptured the loot plundered from his own realm. And all this had been done with him and his son at the fore, in the thickest of the fighting, earning glory and honour in the eyes of men. There would be no stopping him now.